All right, good morning, good afternoon. Professor Barry here, AKA Tom. We are going to jump into today a sociological examination of deviance is kind of where we're going and where we're headed. So the first part of the class, laying out a foundation, going through kind of theories, getting into some different concepts and different ideas, thinking about the development of self, Charles Cooley, George Mead, Goffman and dramaturgy, thinking about groupthink, Ash's study of conformity, like how do we think about human behavior? And now from now on in the class, we're kind of moving into very specialized areas. And our first one that we're going to go into is sociology of deviance. If you're interested in this topic, want to dive in further, we do have Soc 211. It's a fabulous class, super interesting to kind of dive down deeper into this topic area. In some ways, studying deviance is a study of, of culture and society and history, understanding about, cultural notions of race and gender and class, how we think about human behavior. It's a really cool opportunity to explore ideas and thoughts about what is motivating human behavior and how do we regulate human behavior. So it's a cool area. So that's what we're going to do today. We got a lot of stuff to go through, so I'll kind of jump in, get started. But I do want to, one thing that's unrelated to deviance, but just put another thought out there or just sort of another idea. And that's, we never really talked too much about Max Weber. So he's an important sociologist who laid the groundwork of thinking about a rationalization, the impact of the Enlightenment and science and the world modernity, the modern world becoming more complex, systems of rationality, he's the one who first theorized about bureaucracies. He kind of had a love-hate relationship with or had positive and negative things to say about this sort of this shift in society to this new way of increased rationality where there's value and benefit, but at the same time, he says we get trapped in this iron cage of rationality. And we look for more technological solutions to problems versus trying to think outside of the paradigm. And we get kind of caught in this in a way. And one thing I think is kind of interesting is this idea he talks about disenchantment. It always kind of drew my attention to this idea that you can see it in our architecture. You can see it in the sort of the way that the way that we think and process information, our ideas about different aspects of life. But we kind of go to like this idea that with science and more advancement of science, the world becomes less of a spiritual place in a way. It becomes, before is more enchanted. Now it's like we're looking for logical, rational explanations for more and more things. In some ways, there's an enchanting feature of that. But from Weber's viewpoint, it's like the world becomes more disenchanted. I like this idea of, this is a cathedral. We were there a few years ago. It's a beautiful cathedral. It took a few centuries to build. These were the tallest cathedrals, were the tallest structure in a lot of Western European countries, places of worship around the world, sometimes the largest structure in a community. And now we kind of moved, this is from there, the world is this place of religion and spirit in a different way. 2 centuries to build. Here you build it in 6 years, the tallest structure in the world today. I mean, it's just mind-blowing to think that structure was built in 6 years, and the size and scale and scope of what took a few centuries here is built in a short amount of time. Then it's business and commerce. I mean, this is sort of a much more rational expression of a society that's built on and centered around rationality. Unrelated to deviance, but thought I'd throw it out there. All right, so let's kind of go through then. There's prompts after each one of these. So deviance is basically a violation of the social norm. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, who establishes what is the norm? What constitutes a violation? What degrees of violation? Does it matter? Yeah, what degrees of violation are tolerable, or when does the state intervene? Who intervenes when there's a response in terms of somebody violates the norm? Does it matter who violates the norm in terms of a person's age, their race, their class? So the definition, pretty straightforward, but it's going to get us pretty complex, to complex places pretty fast. we think about, okay, well, there's who decides if there's a, if that violation of the norm is worth kind of responding to or trying to regulate and control. There's a value judgment in there. So think about individuals with an addiction to a substance addiction. We could see that as a public health problem, or we could see it as a crime, kind of a criminal justice problem. Those are value judgments that are shaped by all kinds of factors, right? History, time, place, politics, whatever it may be. So, so how something becomes bad is not inevitable, as we'll kind of explore in this. Things aren't necessarily deviant because they're harmful. There's a lot of other things that are going on there as well that are shaping those kind of responses. So in summary, kind of like the sociological perspective of deviance is trying to understand social forces, history, culture, society, social group and position, social status, social constructions and ideas of what is proper and improper behavior. Like these are the things that kind of unpack and understand thinking about deviance. So I'll give you an example. This is just astonishing to me. I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, I guess, in some ways, just knowing the history of patriarchy and sort of gendered notions in society. But here in 1978 was the first criminal case in the state of, not only in the state of Oregon, but in the nation, where a person was charged, a husband was charged with sexual assault of marital rape, of sexually assaulting his wife. He was eventually acquitted, but it was the first criminal case, first trial for a husband to be put on trial for sexually assaulting his wife. That's 1978. So prior to that, sexual assault was happening within marital relationships, but it wasn't something that was protected by, it wasn't something that there was, hold on one second here. All right, I'm back here. Sorry about that. All right, let's see if I can go back one. Yeah, so it's the first court case, criminal court case, 1978. It's like, wow, it's like, what's harmful to others isn't necessarily what's going to be defined as deviant and or criminal. I think that kind of illustrates that. I think we can go down the pathway and think about Martin Luther King. Like now we celebrate the life and legacy of Martin Luther King, and rightfully so. I think personally, rightfully so. It's an important, just representing and supporting ideas of diversity and inclusion and democracy and democratic ideals. But during the time period, he was a rebel rouser. He stood in opposition to the war. He was a labor organizer. He was viewed and identified as a communist. A troublemaker, a liar, that because he's advancing thoughts and ideas that are rubbing up against power. So kind of tells us a little bit about, well, who's defining and how are we thinking about what gets defined as being deviant? So for some, I don't know, this is kind of put this out here because for some, I think looking at deviance can get a little bit uncomfortable because we're not focused on individuals, we're focused on patterns, right? So I'm not going to look at someone who commits violent crime, not interested in the individual story, but rather patterns of violent crime, patterns of ways we think about violent crime. So really opposed to any idea and any claim that, that any particular area that we're going to study, sexual assault, violent crime, or anything, and those are like hard forms of criminality, but we can also go to other things too, like, drug use, somebody wearing pajamas going to the store, just deviance kind of things. We're not going to look at through the lens of the individual. That's sort of this sort of puts us too far in that basket. So we're always looking at that relationship between individuals and society. And I think we're prone to going down the pathway of like bad individual kind of claims. And in part, it fits our cultural values and ideas. And sometimes I think it's used for political gains. the sort of the bad individual. Mass shooters, well, they're just mentally ill. Individualistic explanation, it's kind of lacking any sociological imagination of trying to understand a more complete way, complex way of understanding human behavior. So it's like, it's like, where does that come from? Humans we may be conditioned in certain ways to divide us, these moral positions, of those who are deviant, those who are not, those who are criminal, those who are not. But how we define things and how we decide to respond to things is not inevitable. Those are social and cultural forces. And sometimes when there's intervention in trying to regulate deviant criminal behavior, sometimes it's more about the agent of control than it is about the person or individuals who are identified as deviant or criminal. It's about us versus about them in that regard. So in some ways, for example, think about, individuals who are unhoused or the homeless. Part of it is about, it's like examining the community of people who are unhoused, but part of it's also a story and an examination of community members and the way they think about it and address the problem of homelessness itself. Okay, so sociology of deviance. One thing to kind of separate out is crime and deviance. So a Venn diagram, two circles overlapping. Sometimes, so deviance on one side, criminality on the other. So against the law, against social norms. Sometimes something could be deviant, but not criminal. So getting if I had a tattoo across my forehead, maybe deviant, especially within my social circle. But not a crime, right? Some things can be criminal, but not deviant. So if somebody's jaywalking, it's crime perhaps, but it's not deviant. Criminology is more focused on, and we'll talk about positivism, sort of empirical investigation, trying to quantify or understand what makes people do what they do. And we it's like creating kind of an empirical map of the causes, motivations, dispositions of individuals who commit act A, B, or C. And that's, criminology is much more positivist in orientation, and constructionism is usually linked more to investigations of deviance, although that's not always the case. So to clarify or to kind of explore deviance, let's kind of go through the 4 elements of deviance. But before you get there, so go back, define deviance, explain it, and then discuss different things that sociology looks at, or how does sociology approach understanding or thinking through deviance. So that's the first kind of prompt area. All right, so let's go through the 4 elements of deviance. First, we're going to focus on the act. So like, let's say sexual assault, going back to Rideout versus Oregon in 1978. So whatever that act is, or it could be a act, it could be a condition. So for example, a person with a physical disability, a person with physical deformations. It could also be a attitude or a way of thinking. So people who are members of the Flat Earth Society, people who hold on to beliefs about white supremacy, people who, it's like beliefs that may be against the norm as well. So it could be the act or a condition or an attitude or a way of thinking. But the focus here is on that particular element and trying to understand the meanings that are given to that particular thing. Those meanings that are coming from culture and society, and maybe places of political and social power. So we're looking at how social factors shape meaning. And, sexual assault's being defined in a certain way, starting, it's 1970s, the feminist movement, 1970s, challenging definitions and ways of thinking about, women being harmed by their husbands, and this idea, just more and more shaping of ideas of what we're defining as being deviant and or criminal. Is one question you think here, is taking the life of another person deviant and or criminal? Well, not universally, right? You think about circumstances. I had a student a few terms ago, this question came up, and first he said, well, yeah, for sure, taking the life of another person is deviant. Then immediately he started thinking, well, that's not always true, because in this circumstance or in this circumstance, it's acceptable. Like what's going on in Croatia and Russia, you mean Russian military forces are seeing that this is not deviant or criminal to be taking the lives of Croatians, or Croatians, Ukrainians, sorry. And it's just part of culture at that moment in time. It's like, what's being defined. So not all deviance, also one thing to think about, not all deviance is necessarily voluntary. So sometimes we think about things of being, well, it's people have made decisions to be so-and-so. Could be a person has a disability, born with a physical deformity. It's not voluntary, but yet there's this thing going on there. So lynchings, in one example, lynchings in the South were fairly common. Not only African Americans, some Italians, others were lynched in public square. And look at all the people there. There were souvenirs sold, postcards, body parts after some of these lynchings. I mean, there's actually an interesting compilation, a book, and I believe a short documentary put together about postcards from lynchings in the South. I mean, pretty powerful. Smoking, right? I mean, a classic example. I mean, increasing the smoking age to the age of 21. I mean, in 2017 in Oregon moved that direction. Smoking, we put in an ordinance, 2017, making it a misdemeanor to smoke aerosol or vaporize in a motorized vehicle while a person under the age of 18 is in a motor vehicle. I mean, that's just sort of ripe with questions about what's shaping our definitions of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I would argue that that while there's a health component to that, there's a lot more going on to why that was put into place. Theme 2 that we can look at, we look at the actor. So we have the act or the behavior of the condition. So that's understanding kind of the meanings of how meanings are being constructed, what is being defined as being deviant. Then we move into the actor. Like, does the status of the actor make a difference in terms of whether something's being defined as deviant or the reaction from society itself? So sometimes the status of the person makes a difference. So their race, their class, gender, different parts of their identity, and does that make a difference? Yeah, it's hard to think. So that the insurrection or the insurrection at the nation's capital in January of 2022. That it's hard for me to sort of think about, well, so I wonder if it was a group of people of color who were protesting and engaged and felt that there was a threat to democracy and they stormed the nation's capital, breaking into the Capitol and sort of the vandalism and destruction of property, what the response would have been like. And it's just hard to imagine that the response would have been the same from a host of different sources regarding that. So I think in this case, race is very salient. It makes a difference. This is always like this kind of silly example, but the beer bonging, does it matter on the age? If my mom lives in a retirement community, if I go up there sometime, there's a group of 80-year-olds beer bonging, what would be the kind of response to that? Or what about certain age? What about gender? Males, females, beer bonging? Is there a different assignment of meaning going on there? Wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, protest ideas about that. Does the actor make a difference? People showing up to protest at city council meetings, school board meetings with critical race theory, for example. And I wonder, like with critical race theory, if there was an issue that people of color felt that the school wasn't representing well, and they showed up, in some of the same demeanor and posturing and positioning to school board, whether there would be what the reaction would be. I mean, I think we're trying to bring into our attention with this element that paying attention to the status of the actor. And again, moving away from it like this sort of individual level analysis and ask different questions about things of deviance. So this is, I think, a great example. It's the double standard regarding swear words. And I used to have a colleague, she used to cuss a lot in the classroom, and I had a male colleague, same thing. And she was always kind of frequently criticized for cussing, but he never was, just sort of double standard. We kind of go down the pathway, if you're familiar with Brock Turner, Stanford University, sexual assault case, the response, that, like the crazy argument that he was making about, exonerating himself from any responsibility for that. he is basically let off the hook for sexual assault. So that his status as perhaps race, perhaps class, perhaps both, kind of an element of understanding that. The third element is thinking about the setting. The context makes a difference. So behavior in one context, or an attitude, behavior, or thought in one context, totally okay. Move to a different context, totally different. The rules are different, right? Rules differ based on the context. So, and the context could be chronological time period, or it could be physical. So the context, like, particular environment, public displays of affection, depending on your culture, your society, your age, like those things kind of make a difference. Oregon, legalization of psilocybin mushrooms, and using for therapeutic purposes, that in the context of Oregon, maybe something is more acceptable than in another environment of going to a different state. This person here, I just thought was pretty absurd. He smoked a joint in a Tennessee court, and I don't know the story of why, but just like, okay, that setting is probably not the most appropriate setting. And it's going to be defined as, of course, a violation in that particular environment. The fourth element, an important one, is the audience and the audience response. So in this case, nothing is deviant until there's a response from an audience. So deviance is, there's a relationship between the audience and the actor, and nothing is deviant until there's some assignment of meaning from the audience towards that. So the response is basically social control, regulations. It can range from very micro level, interpersonal connections, family, people we know, all the way to macro level, formal institutions that are regulating behavior. It could be stigma. So stigma is like a marking of an individual as being outside the margins. So it could be like glares, glances, language, things like that, to formal sanctions of person loses their job, their employment, criminal justice kind of involvement thing. For this perspective, the audience response is required for deviance to exist. Smoking on the planes all the way through probably like early 1980s, maybe 1970s. That's probably is 1980s. I remember being in a plane in mid 1980s, and there's the back part of the plane was smoking section of the plane. There's no audience assignment of meaning of that's deviant behavior at that point in time. If there's no audience response, there's deviance does not happen. Deviance is at its core some relationship between the individuals and the audience. Looking at the context kind of thing, and maybe audience response a little bit. This is in European countries, smoking outside. Smoking is viewed differently in European countries than in the United States, right? Same degree of harm, but yet different cultural response, different audience response to that. So for this theme is go through all those four different elements: the actor, the setting, or the act, the actor, the setting, and the audience response. Define, discuss each one of those, and then provide an example that illustrates that. And then answer the question like, what does, looking at these four elements, how does it help us in terms of our understanding of deviance? Now we're going to go through theories. We're going to go through them fairly quick, and we'll spend more time in class going through them. But theories are basically just different perspectives grounded in research. Each theory has its own benefits, its own value, its own limitations. There's no right or wrong theory, but some theories provide more clear, more supported, more valid connections or explanations about behavior. But there's not like there's one right and one wrong. There's like a lot of them, a lot of different theories. So we're going to cover 7 of them. And as you go through, your kind of response at the end is to just identify 4 to 6 key ideas linked up with each theory. You can put it in bullet point form, or you can put it in essay form. Doesn't really matter to me. If you want to explain kind of a summary paragraph or just kind of list out the key ideas, that's all good. So let's start with social disorganization theory. Like I said, we're just going to go rock and roll through these and kind of come back as a class, entering class, kind of go through more. This is our first main theory in sociology. This is a forming idea of criminology, not necessarily deviance, more focused on criminology. It's an early theory of crime. coming out. It's like modernization, industrialization, urbanization, made major changes going on. More people move into the city, rise of social problems. And so there's this theorizing that's going on. Let's look at the way, if we find that crime, violent crime, for example, is higher in certain areas of a community. Like, let's say you map it out, right? Every time there's a violent crime, you put it on a map. Like, this is the core area of the city. This is what early researchers identified like a zone of transition, people moving in and out. There are low home ownership rates. People are less stable within that community in terms of stable members of the community. Like, there's just a lot of social change. This is the working class community, more residential area. Like, this kind of idea of laying out, there's ways in which a community is organized. And that organization shapes the likelihood of certain things going on in that community. So this is a sort of an ecological map. Every time a crime was committed, you could map it out and you could see patterns. And then it raises the question, how are those areas of the community organized differently than the areas where there's a low crime rate? So the focus is on the neighborhood or the wider community. It could be economic, could be social organizations, civic organizations. Are there civic institutions that people are engaged and involved in, such as Boys and Girls Club, or the Lions Club and the Rotary Club, or religious organizations that are there to support people? Are people engaged in the community? Do neighbors know each other? Like all these different kind of things. And this is a profound or a really important theory in understanding places today that have been impacted by post-industrialism. So what that term means is that starting in the 1970s, we started to lose manufacturing jobs, started to go overseas, globalization. Jobs are leaving the inner city in places like Baltimore and Chicago, Oakland. I mean, cities around the United States, jobs left. And when jobs left, people who could leave left, or people who wanted to leave. Some people who wanted to leave and had the resources to leave left. Other people could not leave. Let's just say, for example, and then the unemployment rate goes up, and then there's sort of this breakdown of the social infrastructure in the community. So it's really impact of looking at those kind of things and its impact on things like crime. This is more of a criminological theory. Anomie, sudden dramatic change creates instability. This theory brings to our attention the structural level things versus individual bad actors. And really, it's a theory that helps us to create empathy and understanding and humanizing different groups and populations. As an example, this is Maryland, kind of some crime data on Maryland, Maryland proper, Baltimore. You see like this amazing difference between the two. If you go down the list, and it makes you like, okay, what's going on in Baltimore versus maybe other communities around Maryland that makes it different. If you want, if you want to see this video, type in the language to the video, it'll pop up on YouTube. This is basically Baltimore was a steel town during the time period when there was operating steel mills and people were working within the industry. There's still crime. It wasn't like crime was non-existent, but the rates of crime and all these different things were much lower because the community, people were, there was employment opportunities. With that came economic resources in the community and all these different kind of things. A couple different examples more close to home. This is an HBO film, documentary. So it really came out 2021, maybe 2020. Kind of Our Towns, profiling the photojournalists are profiling cities in the United States that transformed themselves during this time period of post-industrialization. The last city they profile is Bend, and how Bend went from the closing down of the mills to travel tourism and different industries, and it's rebuilt itself. So the social infrastructure and the community, the ecology of Central Oregon, there's a lot of economic vitality. We still have crime, we still have poverty, but imagine what it might be like in a place. This is Nicholas Kristof, who wrote this about his reflecting on his childhood from living in Yamhill, where there's working mills, connections to logging industry. There was manufacturing. I believe there was a rubber plant. They're making rubber gloves there. So there was an economic sector there that disappeared in the 1970s, 1980s. Some people who could leave left and went, started going up towards Portland, moving in that direction where jobs were, leaving behind individuals who didn't have the resources to leave and creating a lot of anomie. So great examples and illustrations of social disorganization theory. Okay, yeah, theme 3. So labeling theory, another one. Labeling theory is nothing is deviant until it's labeled as deviant. Labeling varies in degrees of stigma. So marking individuals as being other, demonizing, just sort of that labeling, stigmatizing of marking individuals as being outside of the group. You can think about it from like Cooley's perspective a little bit about labels, the impact of labels. Sometimes, let's say a person has a history of, let's say, substance abuse, or has mental health challenges or mental health problems going on, and they may hide that from coworkers, or they put that part of their identity and their experience away so that other individuals don't stigmatize them or see them through that. It doesn't become a master status, like the status that has exceptional meaning to others, and the way that we think about, we may see individuals through that lens then. Think about it in terms of like need as well and labeling, that, it's like, well, let me skip those parts. But anyway, like different degrees of stigma attached to that. But think about like labels and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? That language and culture are interactive. Language is an expression of culture. So identifying individuals who have the substance abuse problem could be different labels. Somebody's a crackhead, a meth head, very powerful stigmatizing labels versus a person experiencing a substance abuse addiction. Totally different way of thinking, right? Different language is an expression of cultural values and ideas. Potential that labels are a master status, like I mentioned, that it can be like this exceptional meaning. It becomes important part the way people see that person. It also can be important, like an exceptional status for one's own sense of their own identity. Labels are a reflection of culture and power. And we'll see, I'll provide an example of the power dimension, but sometimes labels are a reflection of dominant culture and their ideas. The language is being used to reinforce dominance and separation between dominance and the subordinate group. There's also like labeling and thinking about the power of labels, Lemert's societal reaction perspective, the idea of primary deviance that happens before being stigmatized, before being labeled as deviant. The secondary deviance is what's the response of the individual or individuals after being stigmatized, and maybe social control measures put into place. So let's say going back, 10 years ago, somebody has a drug conviction. They have to declare that on their employment forms, housing form. They lose the ability to access federal financial aid to go to school. Like all these different reactions from community, either interpersonally or informally, all the way to structures and institutions. Like that kind of response versus seeing it as a public health crisis, that if we look at it through a lens of like this more demonization, moral failing, what's the reaction to individuals based on that? So it could be that they become more and further isolated, and that just like creates more of a problem than it's solving. Tertiary deviance is sometimes people embrace the deviant identity. So people get identified as being such and such. And so one way of reclaiming power is to say, you know what, I am that and own that. It's kind of like an act of resistance in some sort of way. It's always the question, never that labels cause anything. So when I read a paper and somebody says, yeah, labels cause people to be such and such, I go, whoa, that's just way too much power given to the label. We all navigate labels in different ways. People or humans navigate labels in different ways. Labels have an influence. The degree of influence is always kind of, there's just different degrees. It's not so simple as like a cause and effect. A couple different examples. During the war on drugs, the crack scare of the 1980s, 1990s, there's these ordinances put into place throughout a lot of different places. No baggy pants. They're called baggy pants, saggy pants ordinances, making it a violation to wear baggy pants. I think there's a racial dimension to this that's pretty apparent. So, it's, like what's being labeled, identified as being problematic. And then think about the, individuals who are unhoused in our community, even using that language unhoused versus homeless as a shift in language, shift in labeling, understanding. So that's kind of our focus here. I encourage you, Brian Stevenson, there's a great TED Talk from him that you watched before. He wrote a book called Just Mercy. It's a really powerful book. He spent his life, dedicated his life to his career and his life to work with people on death row and looking at racial injustices in the criminal justice system. And he comes from a place of like peace and empowerment, of support, of compassion. I mean, just mercy. It's like having mercy. People can, need to be held accountable for their actions, but at the same time, we have compassion and understanding and mercy. And why I include this here is he has this in a lot of interviews with him. If you like look around for interviews with Brian Stevenson, I mean, you're probably, if you watch one, you're going to come across him saying something like this, saying that, we are more than the worst thing that we've ever done. So if I stole, I'm more than just a thief. This is like a master status thing a little bit. If I embezzled money, I'm more than an embezzler. If I committed murder, I'm more than a murderer. And to see that the humanity of individuals, and that can be a stretch. I told you before, like this area of deviance could be hard for some to kind of like take in, but it's the ability to go, it's possible to understand and humanize and have compassion for, but at the same time to understand that we need to regulate, that people need to be held accountable for their actions, but we can do that in a way that comes from a more well-centered place than a place of moral indignation and a sense of, just a sense it's not really helping. It's more a statement of other things. Other examples, labeling theory, the gay rights movement in 1969, Stonewall Inn in New York, gay club in New York. There's the gay communities being harassed by law enforcement for years. An event happens in 69 at that Stonewall Inn. People start to organize and they're shaping the discussion, right? And then we fast forward basically, let's see, 1970, 36 years later, where the same-sex marriages are supported by the Supreme Court in the United States. We have at BYU, what years? I think it was like 2 years ago, I want to say it's 2020, 2019, at a commencement address talking about coming out and identifying himself that he is gay within the Mormon community at a commencement speech at Brigham Young University. I mean, it's like, whoa, man, cultural ideas and notions of same-sex relations transformed and changed over a period of time. I like this. These charts are interesting. That look at that, 2004, 60% of people disagreed for allowing gays and lesbians to marry. Then it jumps to 61%. Like, wow, that is just like such an amazing change. And one thing I kind of pointed here, there are differences in terms of political party differences, but look at this. This is what, I mean, one thing I'm kind of fascinated by when I see this is that these two numbers are about the same. So that in 2004, Democrats had this, sort of this idea, they favored, 44% favored legal same-sex marriage, and 2019, Republicans at that same place. So major transformations, changes going on. Now, here's some pretty powerful labels to get us on the side of going, whoa, man, there's a lot of demonization going on here. Like, what's going on with like the racial dimensions of this kind of stuff? What's going on with the political aspects of this stuff? Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Bob Dole, senator from a Republican senator from Kansas, using this language of super predators, that some kids, mostly kids of color, Black kids, are born so bad that they are born killers. They are young. And it's this idea that I remember during that time period, news media and things like that, it was like, wow, killer kids. This idea that they're just born with this violence within you. And super predators, that language, imagine what that leads to, the consequences of that language. It justifies locking people up at a young age for long periods of time, life sentences, solitary confinement for kids. I mean, if you're a super predator, we need to protect ourselves from these individuals. This language is not innocent. This language is not neutral. This language is very incredibly powerful for shaping, constructing reality and constructing understanding. And this is like, I like this part, the coming of the super predator should scare us into wanting to get to the root causes of the problem And I think what they're trying to say is that, I don't know, in this particular article is that, that language is driving the way that we think about crime during that particular time period. We can kind of move into something else too, to think about, primary deviance, secondary deviance, and things like this. Look at suicide rates among individuals who are transgender, 0.5% of the population by estimate. But the report of suicide rates and attempted suicide significantly higher. Well, what's going on? I mean, part of that is exclusion, being ostracized, lack of support, stigmatization. It's that secondary element, the impact of the label itself, that may be driving that. Another area of deviance is medicalization. So when deviance is being defined as being deviant by the experts, usually experts, academics, psychiatry, and psychology, primarily psychology, but also could be like the medical field, defining things as being deviant. So who has a vested interest in medicalizing things as deviance? Could be psychiatry, has a vested interest. They see the world through that particular lens, not looking at human behavior from maybe, just looking at through that sort of that lens of psychiatry, looking for internal or looking for, whether it's neurological or pathology, seeing things through a lens of pathology or a medical model. Could be also there's an interest in other institutions, education, criminal justice, other institutions have a vested interest in medicalized ideas of deviance. Pharmaceutical companies for sure, because if it's there could be possibility of medication to address that particular deviance. If it's something that's a pathology that's defined as a mental health pathology. And sometimes it fits our cultural ways of thinking, that maybe we medicalize things and we support that as a general community. Like we are viewing human behavior through this lens, and that's a dominant story and framework in society itself. So it's like the medicalization and looking at things from a viewpoint of things being defined as a pathology. Kind of interesting, in the 1970s, Ken Kesey from Oregon, from Eugene, if you ever read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, like this is a time period in the 1970s, like there was an active anti-psychiatry movement of this kind of like a counter culture revolution going on of opposing and addressing some of the stuff going on within the psychiatric community in the 1950s and 60s, lobotomies, electroconvulsive shock therapy, like these things that were just like, people started seeing there's a lot of inhumane treatment going on. There's just kind of a couple of things, I don't know, just kind of to put out there, kind of things like, this mapping of thinking about, that it must be something internal going on. This is kind of early ideas of, okay, is there some center of the brain that is influencing things like certain dispositions and ideas, like being honest, being reliable. And people look at the features of the head, they call it craniometry, or what's the other word I'm looking for? I can't remember the other name word. Anyway, so I just found these when I stumbled across these. I was like, wow, this is pretty interesting. They go in and like the genuine husband and the unreliable husband and the shape of the head. Like this is pretty fascinating. And this is like mental health treatment, believing that, that we could spend, it was destabilization, something was going on internally inside one's cranium. And so you kind of like put people through a whirling machine or different apparatus in order to kind of stabilize them, kind of thing. Like I said, this is a great interview. I thought it was a really interesting interview with a professor of psychiatry, saying, I think many have promised ideas coming from psychiatry. There's been a lot of work with compassion meditation. Emory University has the most interesting Tibetan Buddhist programs in the US. Evidence that fasting, it's a spiritual practice, has antidepressant effects. So if you deprive yourself of food, elevates states of mind. This is why some people, maybe when they get depressed, they don't eat. It's actually maybe an evolutionarily adaptive mechanism. And there may be some value there. It's an attempt at self-treatment. Hypothermia, overheating the body, also a powerful antidepressant. The use of heat that are part of practice. And what in this interview, and I'll next slide, I'm going to go there too, is what he's saying, kind of getting at is that we got to be careful that we don't over medicalize, but we can also, there's benefit of science at the same time. And I think this is more the nuance where we get to today, is that there's healthy critique of the field, but at the same time, we want to benefit from the knowledge and information from the field as well. This fits in with going back to Weber at the beginning. The ideas of mental health, that the complexity of which we think about mental health is an expression of the development of science and reason and rationality and the empirical method, the medical model. And the question here is, do we put too much faith in the medical model without looking at social and cultural environments in which people live and these kind of things? There's a lot of interesting things about the development of the asylum, of putting people, now we have community mental health centers, but those didn't come into place until the 1960s during the President Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Before, it was state institutions. Rotham's book, I don't know if you're interested in this topic area of the development of institutions, really fascinating. Also, like Salem, this is the institution in Salem, the Institution for the Mentally Ill, the insane asylum. So think about language again there. And then, one for the cuckoo's nest I mentioned. The idea of things like gender dysphoria, I think, is a great example of medicalization. Transgender refers to a person whose sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. Some people experience gender dysphoria, which refers to psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and their own identity. So the question to kind of raise here is that, well, how much is of that dysphoria? That's even a language, like we're calling it that. There's a question about that language. How much of it is a response to the stigmatization from society itself? And if it's coming from a stigmatization of society itself and people struggling with that stigma, it seems that part of it should be identifying the problem lies in the stigmatization itself, not a pathology of the individual. At the same time, recognizing that stigmatization has an impact on the individual. And so therefore, we want to, trying to understand and support individuals who are experiencing that. There's, another sort of example, 1973 was the year that it was voted at the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality as a diagnosable mental health disorder. So before 1973, I can't remember what year it was instituted, but until 1973, homosexuality was a diagnosable pathology, diagnosable mental health disorder. The vote went to the American Psychiatric Association in 73. The majority said we need to remove it. 74, DSM, or Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. In 74, it was changed and removed. Now, the kind of thing I find interesting, one aspect is when it went to vote, it wasn't like a significant majority, or there was a majority of people supported removing it, but it wasn't, like a ratio of 8 to 2, or 80% said let's remove it. I could go back to the numbers, but it was closer than that. So it was like, wow, man, it's like even it was passed, but it wasn't like an overwhelming support for it being passed. We could look at more contemporary kind of thing about identifying premenstrual cycle, and it's called it a syndrome, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Are we medicalizing something of people's experience? Going back way back in time, 1800s, that if a slave ran away from their slave owner, there was an idea from a psychiatrist at that time that they must have drapetomania, that they're caught up in a mania and a rapture and trying to flee. They're mad and they're crazy because no sane person would run away from their slave owner. It's like, man, it's just fascinating, like where the constructed realities that we've gone to in places in the past. And I don't want to go through this. I take time here, but the anti-psychiatry movement, and like Thomas Szasz had this advanced this idea that there's mental illness is a myth. And let me kind of clarify that. What he is saying is that if an individual is experiencing something like, for example, that has neurological roots or physiological ones, let's say they're actively psychotic, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't actually there. So there's an active psychosis. It's a neurological condition, a medical condition, not a psychiatric condition. So he does not deny that people are experiencing things, but if there's a biological root to it, it's a medical problem, not a psychiatric problem. They said that everything else are just problems in living, that there are problems that humans experience and that our environments are a shaper in that. And this is like the kind of the pushback going on at that time. So here's just kind of a reflection on thinking about a little bit of the stuff, is that And mental health is an important area to address. We experience anxiety, depression are fairly common in our population. Most individuals, 20% in a year's time period experiencing some mental health challenges going on. And you look at it based on different groups and different demographics. Part of that is related to the environments and the context that we live in. How we understand that, I think, is really important. And this is that point I was making earlier. It's not that the DSM, that's worthless. There's a lot of wisdom, but we need to balance things out and see things in different ways. And that's a good opportunity to let you know there's counseling services available through COCC, free to students. I can't remember if it's 6 sessions, but in collaboration with St. Charles Behavioral Health. It's like having a life coach. Life coaches are great. So just be aware of that resource, or I want you to be aware of that resource. Conflict theory. Now we're going to get into power, inequality, domination, these kind of things. So conflict theory application is that how we define what is criminal, or what is defined as criminal, is related to power. Go back to Rideout versus Oregon. Look at the war on drugs, look at different policies, that there's something about race, class, gender, or other dimensions going on there, or sodomy laws, laws that are coming from places of difference of power. So it could be definitions of crime, could be the way in which law enforcement practices happen, for example. Here we're focused on your criminal justice system, but it could be education, any institution and how institutions regulate behavior. There's different things about, how people get processed through the criminal justice system, or the steps that go through, having legal representation, the class biases that are there. And if you get into class biases, you're going to get into racial biases that are with that as well. The war on drugs, looking at different responses to substances, viewing it not as a public health problem, but viewed as a crime problem. Maybe part of that is like wrapped up into kind of racism in society itself and how that filters into the way that we think about particular social problems. We take a model of retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, versus rehabilitation. So the question to ask here for a conflict theory is whose interests are served in that model? If rehabilitation actually helps to provide healing and bringing people back into the community, integrating them, why don't we go down that direction? Are there interests to be protected in another? Maybe part of its cultural values, but maybe part of its interest. Certain policies like stop and frisk were popular in New York are now viewed as unconstitutional because of violation of fundamental protections, constitutional protections. Same with broken windows, these sort of philosophies that if there's a broken window and it's not fixed, that's kind of like the start of a process of the downfall of a community. I think these policies came out of, sometimes were extrapolated from research, like the researchers of broken windows actually opposed the way it was being deployed or used by certain law enforcement departments across the nation. So this wasn't this wasn't what our research was concluding, what is going on in terms of policy and practice, but it's issues of power. If you have inequalities that are built in society, it's going to come through institutions, and a powerful institution of social regulation and control is the legal system and criminal justice system. A couple different examples outside of race, but looking at different communities establishing laws, rules, and regulations regarding sharing food with people who are homeless. Like, well, what's going on? Restricting restricting of people to provide food and services for people who are homeless. I mean, how to make sense, to make sense of that. No loitering, these sort of loitering laws, vagrancy laws, another example. Ticket scalping, another area, I guess, some sort of way. Yeah, if you want, so the theory of crime and policing was born and went terribly wrong. So the unconstitutionality of stop and frisk, something that was common practice for many years that led to disparate outcomes or different outcomes in terms of racial outcomes for who was being arrested and put into jail or prison because of these kind of policies. Functionalism has a viewpoint that deviance exists across time and place. It's in every community, so it must have a function. You can't eliminate deviance. Deviance is necessary for society to work and operate. If you remove certain things of deviance, other things will be added because we need deviance in order to be able to create different things. One of them, through deviance, we're clarifying what our values are. We're establishing boundaries of how much is acceptable and what's not acceptable. Through deviance, you create solidarity between us and them. And it promotes sometimes social change. People are drawing, through deviance as a marker of maybe there's a dysfunction in society and something needs to change. One of the limitations of the functionalist model, it doesn't address very well, or at all, or I should say very well, issues of inequalities and power. So like why sodomy laws? So, male to male sexual encounters are now, were criminalized. And, like that, this functionalist perspective doesn't help us to address that as well. A couple different examples. This is 1968 Mexico Games, Olympic Games. Two athletes, Carlos and, I can't remember the other athlete, and an Australian athlete in support as well, took the stand, Black Power, sign of Black Power. They had their medal stripped from them. They're trying to draw attention not only to racial inequalities, but also to other issues in the United States at that time. Kaepernick, more recently, taking a stand against a social issue, social problem. Why is that being defined as deviant? Maybe it's an issue of power in a way. Maybe it's an issue of, from a functionalist perspective, it started a lot of conversation about the role of race and racial inequalities in society. Is it appropriate for an athlete to take a stand or not? We're clarifying our ideas about racial injustice in society through conversations that are going on in response to Kaepernick or response to other things. Different examples, I'll just go through one. So a lot of times immigration, anti-immigration kind of fever going on in a time period. This is the Black Irish. This is 1800s, early 1900s, this fear that the Black Irish, Irish were viewed as racial others, and the Chinese were devouring Uncle Sam. This is a long story. This is a story that Americans have told for a long time, and there's political reasons for telling that story, but this idea that it's the outsider who's destroying America. And we can hear that story even today. Part of that story, you could go conflict theory, right? But you also could go a lot of change going on. It's a way of defining in-group, out-group, solidarity, creating solidarity. It's a way of clarifying our values. But the problem or the limit of the functionalist perspective, it just doesn't deal with that issue of power in a constructive way. House of Un-American Activity Committee, 1950s, fear of communism during that particular time period. I mean, you could say that time period in the communism, the struggle, the opposition to communism was bringing America together, kind of thing. Of course, it was, there's a lot of conspiracy stuff going on, but the function of deviance in this case could say is bringing people together. Wow, so kind of through a lot. Okay, so strain theory. So I'll try to speed these up a little bit. Strain theory, cultural goal. Every culture, society has a cultural goal, and they have the means to get there. American society, our cultural goal is the American dream, wealth, status, position, middle class, upper middle class life. Then there's the institutional means. Do you live in a community that you have the means to get there? Merton strain theory is an examination of patterns, not individual level analysis. So looking at some sort of combination so that the conventional means are things like going to school, being employed, doing the right things, all these different kind of things, conventional pathway to get to the cultural goal, the American dream. Most people, regardless of what economic and circumstance or community they live in, conform. They conform both to the means as well as the goals. So sometimes we think about the inner city, we think about kind of could possibly think about that that most people are doing wrong things, bad things. Most people are doing the right thing. But there are higher rates of other problems going on in those communities. What Merton's kind of going after is that things like innovation, let's say engaging in the drug dealing trade, buying and selling drugs, distribution, It's innovation for Merton. It's like, the individuals who have don't have the means to get to the cultural goal are innovating. They're coming up with different ways to get there. So in that kind of case, and not every one of those environments does that, but the pattern is it's in those environments that people are doing that kind of thing. So yeah, so then every once in a while, this idea of, conformity, innovation, ritualism is, for example, people going to job every day, but they're not trying, they kind of like, I've given up on the American dream, but they're doing the conventional thing. Retreatism, things like alcohol, substance abuse, individuals who decide to retreat from society itself. They reject the means, they reject the goals. They just kind of like, it's almost like resignation. And then rebellion, sometimes as we as a society change what we view as being the goal and we change the availability of means. I think in the Pacific Northwest, what's going on right now is we're reevaluating, and maybe across the nation, youth across the nation are questioning the model of the American dream. So if that American dream and the means, it's like harder to get those economically, those higher paying jobs are getting more restrictive. One way of dealing with that strain is to readjust the cultural goal itself. Sutherland differential association, the belief for Sutherland is that all behavior is learned, deviant behavior is learned. You learn it in environments. People learn the motivations, the rationalizations, the attitudes to be committing something. The more priority individuals give a particular group, the more likelihood they're going to do something. The more intensely they're involved in the group, the more that group's going to have an influence on them. So it's not an on-off switch. It's a learning behavior, and it's happening where people differentially associate into a group. People, the first time individuals usually drink hard alcohol or drink hard alcohol, it's with a group of friends who are providing encouragement, support, rationalizations, all these different kind of things. Same with smoking. It happens in that sort of social environment. What Sutherland's kind of observation is sometimes, there's a breaking point, kind of like you have a fulcrum, something's teeter-tottering. And when a person enters into a social group that's kind of, let's say they're opposed to engaging in behavior A, after being in that group for a period of time, given rationalizations and justifications, maybe they've learned how to evade the law, that their likelihood of committing that particular act is more likely because it's more favorable to break the law or less unfavorable to break the law. Sutherland's first examination was on white collar crime, which kind of makes a lot of sense. I think that the more you know about embezzlement, the more you're around individuals who embezzle or commit fraud, the more you know the law, all these different kind of things are all learned things that may shape that. And then social bond theory, social control theory, what Hershey asked the question is not why do people commit deviance or crime, but why not? That we all basically have the ability or capability of committing crime or deviance, so why do we not do it? It's not because individuals are morally better than other individuals, but he says, but his focus is on people who have more to lose, have a greater stake in conformity itself. So the focus here is that individuals who are attached to conventional society, so conventional meaning employment, education, people in the community who are, law-abiding, conforming individuals, that there's greater attachment, a belief in conventional society, a belief in that structure and order, an opportunity to be participant, to engage, to be supported, to develop a way of life within those institutions, that you have more to lose. That it's not that I'm morally a better person than person over here. It's just I have a lot to lose, greater stake in conformity. I think in some ways, when you look at a local program, partnerships with youth, working with youth whose parents are incarcerated, working to pair these kids up with other people who are members of the community is a way of bonding individuals, integrating kids into kids who are higher, I don't want to use it well, they're more at risk for future problems potentially, is connecting them to others that are more conventional and being supporting them in that journey. But this theory doesn't answer everything. You have Robert Kraft, owner of the Patriots a few years ago, who was prosecuted for involving himself in a prostitution sex ring. I mean, it's like, it doesn't answer everything. So prompt 3, right, was going through each theory, listing out some key ideas of each. A lot of stuff, a lot of information to unpack. We'll talk about it in class. Thanks for participating in the journey. See you all next time. See you in class. We'll kind of end there. Have a good day. And that's it.